Hello, and welcome to Utopian and Dystopian Fictions, a podcast hosted by me, Matt Leggett, a senior lecturer at the University of Winchester, where I teach utopian and dystopian fiction.
And me, Liam Knight, an independent scholar with a PhD in English literature from the University of Birmingham.
In this podcast, we interview scholars, thinkers, and writers from different disciplines, inviting them to discuss what interests them about utopias, dystopias, and speculative fiction.
Whether you're a student, scholar, or someone looking for reading recommendations, we hope you enjoy listening along. If you do, please let us know by rating and following the podcast wherever you are listening, leaving us a comment, or dropping us an email on utopian and dystopian fictions at gmail.com. So then, Matt, who did you speak to this time round?
Well, Liam, in this episode, I had the pleasure of speaking to Dr. Emily Friedman. Emily is Professor of English at Auburn University, Alabama, and an 18th century literature scholar gone rogue. Pun is intended in this case. The pun won't make sense until you hear what the episode's about. But anyway, as you'll tell quickly from our discussion, literature isn't the subject of the episode. Emily is currently finishing a book for MIT Press, which will be out next year, called The Actual History of Actual Play, or The Actual History of Actual Play, rather, I suppose I should pronounce it that way. This is because she's best known for her work in the tabletop role play space. Essentially, she's living my dream as a literature lecturer who gets to spend much of her time talking about Dungeons and Dragons. So Emily's engagement in the field of actual play, we talk about this in the interview, has seen her gain the reputation of the go-to scholar in the field. And as she told me, when she was recently interviewed by The Guardian, they found her by Googling D&D professor. I was lucky enough to catch her while she was touring the UK for a month. And I think one of the things we don't actually mention in the interview, so I thought I'd bring it up here, is how I first became aware of her work. So back on the hellscape of Twitter, before everyone abandoned it, I saw a few years ago that Emily had managed to get Matt Mercer of Critical Role fame to come and speak to her class. Now, if you don't know who Matt Mercer is, you can look him up. He's pretty famous. If you're certainly very famous if you're in this space. So, for those of you who don't know, I have no idea at all what I'm talking about. Matt Mercer is the dungeon master for the actual play phenomenon called Critical Role. And Critical Role was a D&D game. It started as a kind of home game, which, as they like to repeat as their mantra, is, quote, a bunch of nerdy-ass voice actors sitting around playing Dungeons and Dragons. And that set of voice actors now has a following of nearly 3 million YouTube subscribers and a huge global fan base. So they've become the face of D&D actual play, and they regularly sell out stadiums when they tour their show around the world, right? So they're well known. Some of our conversation actually sort of featured around this sort of idea of sort of celebrities who are super well known in one particular sort of space, but then no one else has ever heard of them. So anyway, the story goes that when Emily asked her class if there was anyone she could bring in to talk to them, like an external speaker or something, one of the students asked her to get Mercer. And it became a bit of a joke, but when Emily tweeted about the request, Matt Mercer reached out and said, well, why not? And then the rest is history. And Emily now counts Mercer as a friend and has herself become this sort of bridge point, if you like, between the actual play space and academic criticism. She's interviewed, spoke to, all of the sort of big players really in that space, which is obviously great to find out. And when we were having a lot of fun, Liam, chatting before and after the interview about some of these sort of stories. So anyway, what do we actually discuss in the interview? Emily started by elaborating on the origins of this term actual play and what it means in today's context. We talked about our shared interest in Dungeons and Dragons, how we got into it. And from there, we talked a little about how these games are kind of artifacts, if you like, of utopian and dystopian fiction. So Emily pointed out that D&D is fundamentally a power fantasy, which immediately didn't make me feel great about my enjoyment of it. But yeah, the worlds created by Critical Role and other D&D streamers and players often blend utopia and dystopia. But since they often offer post-apocalyptic worlds where danger is around every corner, it seems kind of interestingly dystopian. But on the other hand, you've got these players who have all this agency, and they commonly also sort of showcase sort of progressive ideals and politics. So you can see this kind of utopian draw, but this sort of against this sort of dystopian backdrop. Drawing on Darko Suvin, I put it to Emily that where science fiction has been associated with radicalism, fantasy is often regarded as principally conservative. In the tabletop role-play game setting, however, this often seems to be upended, right? So central to the more optimistic outlook of fantasy when in role-play environments, Emily suggests, is the relationship between players and in particular the subsequent desire for happy endings. When you're spending vast amounts of time together with friends, you become invested in those happy endings for those characters. They become kind of central. So it's difficult, obviously, therefore, to have an entirely dystopian, pessimistic kind of setting. So this also runs up against, however, the element of chance involved in actual play, where we witness fortunes change on the roll of a die. So in that sense, we have these kind of moments of drama, which are often can turn dystopian in some respects. So after this, Emily gave us a bit of history about the origins of Critical Role. We talked a bit about the role companies play. So Critical Role is a growing entertainment company now, rather than just a group of nerdy-ass voice actors. The way in which these companies sort of play a role in regulating fan communities, and also the way that Critical Role gave its audience a sense that they were a part of the group's private lives in some sense. So Emily was more pessimistic about this than me, I think, and suggested that at a certain point, the fan spaces around Critical Role became kind of impossible to manage and direct. As someone who a number of years ago wrote a still unpublished piece about the utopian potential of fan communities demonstrated by Critical Role, this was a little bit disappointing for me to hear, not least because it probably means I've got to go back and rewrite the whole thing if I want to publish it. But yeah, from here, our conversation turned to the political dimension of tabletop role-play games and actual play. So generally, Emily rejected the idea that these were spaces held apart from politics by fantasy and their emphasis on kind of locality, if you like. She spoke about some of the more overt political content produced by prominent actual play faces like Brennan Lee Mulligan and Abria Iyengar. So much of the politics often relates to identity and inclusivity, where the more utopian strands of actual play seem to be centered. And then, we finished off with the usual kind of questions we ask our interviewees, Liam. But that I think sort of covers the interview from my perspective. What did you think of it?
Yeah, thanks, Matt. Yeah, it was a really interesting interview, and as sort of you've sort of disclosed just there, but also you mentioned in the interview, both of us have a bit of a, is it even guilty anymore? I don't know, about guilty pleasure with Dungeons and Dragons, and we'll occasionally message each other about Critical Role and so on. I'm about a month behind at this point, given my most recent workload, so I'm slowly trying to catch up at the moment. But yeah, I think something for me that maybe we could sort of pull out from the discussion you had with Emily is the sort of utopian potential, or the utopian move that's involved in partaking in a TTRPG like Dungeons and Dragons. And so what's interesting is that there's, firstly, I suppose there's something utopian in the sense of taking part in a TTRPG is an act of sort of collaborative storytelling, right? That's what I love most about playing D&D, is that you're telling a story with friends, and I suppose there's something utopian in that, in sort of it being community or community action or collective action. There's, I suppose, the utopianism of having autonomy whilst playing the game to make choices. There are utopian and dystopian elements in the worlds in which those stories take place, or often actually both at the same time, right? There are characters trying to make maybe an outright dystopian, or if not oppressive or bad or evil in some way, no place, right? It's all fantasy, it's all imagined, it is a no place. So therefore dystopian in that sense, trying to make it better, which is a utopian move. But then also something that I was thinking about when it then came to actual plays, a lot of the companies or groups or what have you that are making these is that they are themselves maybe quite a utopian form of work or labour, by which I mean, again, they are sort of grassroots, I suppose. They are worker led. I'm not really sure if I've got the right terminology here, but in terms of, I think there's something very utopian about a group of people, a group of friends, sort of finding a niche and creating a product, he says, doing sort of air quotes, that is, although it's still subject to some of these sort of capitalistic whims and so on, it feels still quite liberating. It's sort of using those whims and cogs for your benefit rather than for the powers that be. And also, I think, especially because this is in sort of the education, sort of not education, the entertainment sphere, which is obviously incredibly hard to get into, requires, it's a very wealth-driven sort of sphere. There's something quite utopian there about people who seem quite normal, quite everyday, doing that. Although, of course, there's lots in there about, well, these are, as we know, nerdy ass voice actors. They are very talented. They have industry connections and so on. So maybe that problematizes it from a critical role perspective. But still, the idea that at least in the late 10s to early 2020s, that people at a more grassroots level could create an actual play, and that was a possibility for them. I think that's utopian to an extent. So yeah, there's a sort of a really muddled thought there, Matt, but I don't know if you want to say anything about that or anything else about the episode that resonated with you.
I don't know, I'd pick the bones out of that, Liam. There's loads of strands there. I mean, just on that last point, I do think that's where Critical Role, have been super successful. So I think, Emily maybe, she's obviously very aware of the fan spaces in a way that I'm not. So, I'm she's involved, she's on the message boards and she's in the Discord chats and things like that, and so she gets to see firsthand like maybe some of the more toxic elements in that. But from an outside perspective, someone enjoying the content, Critical Role always gave me the impression that the fans were really behind what they were doing, appreciated the work that was going in, didn't resent the success that the company had found. It did feel like it was well earned and hard earned. And generally speaking, they sort of took the ethos of Critical Role and ran with it. The sort of ethos to be kind to one another. And that these were kind of, the fact that these were friends really helped that and help build that. And so it sort of goes back to one of the things you were saying about that sort of utopian aspect of D&D, is that you're playing with friends, you're creating a story with your friends. And it's both sort of local and global at the same time. So this is kind of one of the things I was writing about in this paper, was this idea of kind of hearth to cosmos. That there's a sense of, there's a sense that at the end of the session, the players gather at a tavern somewhere, and they share a glass of, or a tankard of mead by a roaring fire, and they talk about their day and how, and the battles that they've had. And there's something very homely and wholesome and sort of friendly about that. But at the same time, in other aspects of the game, you go to the sort of very ends of the cosmos in terms of the sort of superpowers that the player themselves sort of accrues, and in terms of the sort of politics of the game, where you can be sort of fighting local battles, but you can also be sort of engaging with kings, queens, and democracies or whatever, and you can play around in that sense. So you're playing sort of both something small, homely, and familiar with friends, but you're also doing it on a grand stage often at times. And I think that's something that can only really be replicated by D&D. So I do think there's a lot of kind of interesting utopian strands there. One thing I did want to pick out actually as well is one of the other things I was writing about with this is there's a reputation for utopian fiction that utopianism, that it has a kind of limit to its size. There's a kind of size limit placed on what a successful utopian community can look like. Once it gets too big, the whole thing sort of dissolved. I mean, you could go right back to More's Utopia and think about the way in which he sort of says, well, there are these cities and we have certain limits on the size, and when we get too big, we have to have missionaries that go out and convert other places. There's a kind of imperialism there, right? But that's all about sort of size, space, resources, etc. So we've become very concerned with the idea that utopias only work on small scales. You can have like a 10-person hippie commune that works for a while, but you can't have a utopian country because there's all sorts of problems that emerge with size. And one of the things I was fascinated with was the way in which Critical Role seemed to be building from scratch, basically, a utopian form of community on a grand scale, and we're sort of demonstrating that with the right ethos and with the right people leading and with the right attitudes towards others and towards their product, if you like, they could build a utopian community that was also a product in some way. And I was really fascinated by that as a kind of process, and I thought it kind of spoke to the myth that utopian communities must necessarily be small. So as I suppose one of the things I was kind of writing about, and I kind of hope that piece one day finds its way to people. But maybe I'll have to do some substantial rewriting. But
I mean, not to poo-poo on that too much, but I sort of push back slightly in that I think, and of course now we're talking about Critical Role really specifically, and it's something that you and I both have a lot of interest in, and I came to it just before COVID hit, because some friends I met when I started my PhD, we started playing D&D together. They recommended Critical Role, and
are you gatekeeping here, Liam?
I'm not. I'm just saying.
You know more about this space than me because you were
I was
watching
there first,
it a month before I was. No, I'm winding you up.
But the Critical Role fan space is huge, right? And it is enormous, and that's and it is generally built upon really positive values. As in a sign off for much of the episodes of Critical Role is don't forget to love each other, don't forget to be kind and compassionate and so on. But even from the actual play's sort of early beginnings, there were pockets of the fandom that were behaving in really misogynistic ways towards one or two of the players in question, or even more recently, the group, not even that recently now, but the group sort of faced criticism for being very white presenting, being quite whitewashed, and so they have done some brilliant things to have a more diverse cast of players, but then which is a positive move. But then again, elements of the fandom have reacted quite negatively towards that, i.e., certain people have been quite racist, I think, in certain parts of the community towards the people of color who are on the cast. I suppose it's just that I don't want to completely disagree with what you're saying, because I don't. I think there's an asterisk there, right? Of it is definitely built upon and has its the fandom, the fan space has real utopian elements or intentions, but I do wonder, in essence, the bigger you get, the likely increases that you'll get one or two bad apples who will then start to espouse negative views, or views that maybe rail against that ideology a little bit. And even actually, I'm not sure how much of a Redditor you are, but even on Reddit, there are two main Critical Role subreddits, because there was a schism in the community between those that were always very, this is probably a real gross oversimplification that someone somewhere will take issue with, but in essence there was one
direct your hate mail to Liam.
Don't flood the podcast inbox with your criticisms here, send them to me directly. But there's essentially one half of the schism is for fans who are pretty much only ever positive about what's going on with Critical Role and surrounding Critical Role and so on. And there's the other half, possibly. And those are your people. But then there's the other half where they do problematize and criticize and voice dissent, whether that is again sometimes dissent that is I think reasonable, and then there is some dissent and criticism that it is some of these maybe more bad faith actors that are sowing discord. So yeah, I think just Critical Role, as even Emily put out, like there's lots of different ins to it now. It's not just the actual play, it's the animated show, it's the graphic novels, it's the comics, it's etc. And I suppose because of that, you're just getting different people in the fan space who are going to not all sing from the same hymn sheet necessarily.
I think I was just kind of, I mean, I I have to bow to Emily's superior knowledge in this area, because she just, as I said, she's plugged into those spaces, so she knows. I'll probably have to do some rethinking, rewriting. I think the starting point almost for the piece was just that, having said, I just spent hours and hundreds of hours with these people. That's what it felt like, and I was kind of like, why am I so fascinated by them? What is it that drives people to spend that amount of time with these people and to feel almost like they them? It must be really difficult for them, because they must have people bumping into them in the street and saying and talking to them as if they feel like they really get to know them. And so I kind of was just really interested in that sort of phenomenon and what they've managed to do to achieve that. So yeah, it wasn't really from a utopian angle in the first place. I was kind of trying to get at what spell was it that they had cast on me, and that sort of got me thinking about utopias a little bit more. Anyway, I think we're maybe going off topic.
We are, yeah. How about then that we pass over to yourself and Emily?
Yeah, let's stop wasting everyone's time. Let's go for it. So in this episode, I'm joined by Dr. Emily Friedman. Emily, can you please introduce yourself to our audience?
Hi, I'm Dr. Emily Friedman. I'm the Jean Wickstrom Liles Professor of English at Auburn University. I'm generally understood to be the most senior expert in actual play, the process by which people play role-playing games for the public. And I have just finished the manuscript of my book on the subject, The Actual History of Actual Play is its working title. And it covers the previous 20 years of digital actual play and beyond.
And we were talking just before the recording started that you're the most discoverable professor of actual play. What was it? Someone you said that the Guardian found you by typing in, what was it? Professor of D&D or something?
D&D professor, which there are definitely people who have better claims to that. John Boltena alone at UC Merced teaches or has taught for quite some time a course for first-year students that uses D&D as a framework. It's really, quite frankly, stolen valor on my part, because while I have been teaching TTRPGs and storytelling since the fall of 2021 as this kind of strange pivot in my career as a literary scholar, I almost never teach D&D. Students come in with knowledge of D&D or acquire knowledge of D&D along the way, but there's a real fascinating and much more kind of fit for the classroom in terms of scale and size and whatnot, kind of corpus of games, so it's nice to kind of be able to braid them together.
I'm probably like you, they may come in with no knowledge of D&D at all, but they're definitely going to leave with some knowledge of D&D if I'm teaching them. I'm just conscious that, this podcast is a bit of a vanity project, I suppose, in that, we just do what we want and get guests on that we want to speak to. And so I've got to say, Liam and I both have a kind of guilty interest in Dungeons and Dragons, but also in Critical Role, which we'll talk about a bit later. But I'm very conscious that our audience might not share that. And so I kind of wanted to just pick up on a couple of things that you said there, just to clear it up. TTRPGs are tabletop role-play games, right?
Yes.
D&D being the kind of most famous one that most people will have heard of, but others are also possible. And then actual play is people are supposed to play their games live for the public, usually on kind of streaming platforms. Is that
Yeah,
fair?
so
And would you add to that?
yeah, so actual play was originally a term that was used in indie game design fora at the turn of the millennium. Most famously, a website called Indie RPG, also more colloquially known as the Forge. It is the cradle of what we call story games. People might be familiar or should look up Apocalypse World and the Powered by the Apocalypse games, which kind of beget an entire way of playing that was designed to be played quickly, concisely, and with kind of real emphasis on narrative. And so actual play, among those kinds of game designers who are trying to find this new way of designing games and prioritizing things beyond the wargaming origins of D&D, like a lot of us, theory is a beautiful thing, but evidence from actual play experience becomes really important. And so actual play starts out as this kind of forum category of give us your specific examples from your play experience. That could be play reports, that can be transcripts of people's exchanges, it can be small clips and recordings. And over time, after the Forge closes, that phrase kind of escapes out into the wild and starts to take on its modern meaning, which is any form of the umbrella term Shelley Jones uses is documented play. Actual play, more specifically, is recording of role-playing games. Sometimes can be in kind of podcast form where it's edited and cut for time or given post-production effects. It can also be live streamed. It became extremely popular on Twitch in the late 2010s and the early 2020s. But it also can exist on vertical platforms like TikTok and Instagram stories and YouTube shorts. It kind of goes everywhere. And of course, all of this digital version of actual play is just the most recent version of what we know is many, many decades of people playing role-playing games in front of audiences in drag shows and at conventions and all kinds of things. So one of the things that I'm doing, one of my contributions to this field of actual play studies, which has a fair amount of material that we've been collecting since the late 2010s, is to say that actual play has all of these different diverse reasons why people make it, ways they make it, and reasons why people want to watch or listen to it. It's a really interesting emerging field of kind of relating to play in ways that we don't always think about.
And I suppose there's also LARPing, isn't there? Live action role
Yes.
play, which is presumably adjacent, and the thing that's the difference here is that it's being recorded in some way rather than or aliveness.
So you can make an actual play of a LARP. It's very difficult documenting LARP. So the thing about LARP is that everyone is participating, and they're participating not at a table, but in a parlor LARP. You might all be in a room, but you might be scurrying around doing different kinds of things. A blockbuster LARP, a very large scale LARP, could have dozens or hundreds of people involved, all kind of doing their own things for hours to days. And so how do you represent that to the people who are not part of that experience is been a kind of constant challenge. But yeah, with LARP, there is no passive audience. There are only participants, although you can try to kind of represent it to a larger audience in those kinds of ways.
And bringing this back to the subject at hand, I suppose. I mean, I play D&D far too often, I suppose, more than I probably should. In fact, I've got so I do dungeon mastering or game mastering for a group. We play monthly, and we've got a campaign that's been running for about just over 3 years now, and I've got a document for that, and it's about 120,000 words long, and it's such a guilty pleasure. In that time, I could have written at least a book out of that 120,000 words, but instead I've invested it, I think wisely, in playing D&D.
Yeah, our leisure time is an important part of our lives. I mean, one of the hazards of academic life, and I'm a good example of it, is when we turn our pleasures into our research. That's a interesting trade-off. But yeah, those my own home D&D game started the Sunday before Critical Role started airing. As it turns out, in a weird parallel, I would only realize many years later. And that group, my 18th century group, as well as my experimental game tasters and all the other people that I've had the privilege of playing with in different kinds of ways, have really been an important part of my creative life, my intellectual life, and beyond.
But I mean, it's an addictive sort of thing, isn't it? And you end up sort of, I suspect, as the professor of actual play, you must get invitations to play with people all the time. It must be quite difficult to resist. I mean, to what extent though can we think about these spaces? What is it that's so appealing about them? Because I kind of, my claim is that I've got an interest in utopian and dystopian storytelling. So, and I kind of feel like these spaces lend themselves to that. Do you see that as well, or am I just sort of trying to invent a way to justify my play?
No, I think like a lot of art forms, right? There's a lot of different ways in which people experiment with any new kind of medium or genre. And so you definitely see, especially given the enormous market share of games like D&D, which is a power fantasy, right? In its brute force, you progress, you gain power. The structure of the game is to slowly beat bigger and bigger adversaries until you are big damn heroes, practically gods, right? And so that lends itself to certain kinds of utopian kind of imaginaries. It also lends itself very easily to dystopias, right? That characters can then kind of navigate their ways in all kinds of ways. And of course, Critical Role has been a famous example of creating these interesting worlds that are post-apocalyptic. They are structured as such, but also with elements of utopian thinking. They are more progressive in terms of gender and race and sexuality than the world we currently live in a lot of kinds of ways. So yeah, I mean, you can, if to the extent that fantasy is a major element of a lot of actual play, not all, but a lot, you are going to see people kind of navigating in those kinds of themes and topics and ideas as part of as a big dollop of the palette, for sure.
Something you said there has made me think about the way in which we often think of fantasy as perhaps politically conservative. So this is kind of drawing on the ideas from Darko Suvin, this idea that perhaps fantasy is conservative, whereas science fiction is politically radical, has more sort of radical potential. So, I mean, what you suggested there is that it's kind of a complex relationship in something like D&D, for example, where you've got these predominantly fantasy spaces, but people are involved in writing these spaces themselves, co-writing these stories, and that certain types of people gravitate towards these spaces rather than others. And maybe this challenges this idea that fantasy spaces are politically conservative. You suggested that certainly in terms of its identity politics, perhaps it's not the case. What, any thoughts on that?
I think one of the challenges that actual play faces is that it is often, for all its progressive kinds of trappings and ethos, right? These are sincerely held beliefs. There is a certain amount of, I would not say capital C conservatism, but lowercase, like structural kinds of conservatism. One of the challenges of the structure of something like D&D is that's often been brought up is that it's not about collective action, right? It's about it's the most common narrative is found family. You find your people. They are a posse of 4 to 6 people ideally, and you are fighting on behalf of them. You are gaining power in collaboration with them, but everyone else is NPCs. And I think about this a lot because my next book is a mini graph, a shorter book on Kieran Gillen's Die, which is both a comic and a game that are developed contemporaneously with one another. Kieran uses documented play and actual play as part of the play testing because it's being developed and refined during the COVID lockdowns in this country, in the UK. And that is a meditation very explicitly on why we love role-playing games, especially these kinds of D20 games, games that involve a 20-sided die, and specifically fantasy. The concept of die is in both versions of it is that a group of people who have either played together in the past or who are members of some kind of creative collective. They may have made a comic book together or done a short film or that sort of thing. Then have realized in the years since that project or since that gaming group that their lives have not gone the way that they wanted them to. And it's at that point that one of them has found the mechanism to pull everyone into the world of die. And die is very explicitly the fantasy world you want to be in. You are super powered, you can do almost anything that you want. And the game's structure is to give you this really fun space to play a really fun version of a D&D style game. But the game has an ending. It has a core, which is, are you going to stay forever or are you going to go home? Mm-hmm. And the key rule here is that everyone must agree. The vote is unanimous. This is the players in both the comic and in the game, if you play it, are informed of this immediately. The vote must be unanimous or the world explodes. The dead don't get a vote. But if you kill another player, they're not completely off the board. They're empowered in such a way, they're kind of like the zombie, where if they kill you, if they kill a living player, they come back to life. So what is set up by the structure of die is this emotional negotiation that's far more important than the power fantasy of all the cool things you can do, about how badly do you want to stay? And all of you have a little bit of a reason to stay because your lives have not gone quite the way you wanted to. And are you willing to sacrifice your friends in order to do so? How far are you willing to go in order to live this power fantasy, which is also the name of another comic, also by Gillen. And so that is very much a kind of active creative criticism that is very influenced and in conversation with things like Critical Role and the current state of role playing and the ways in which really kind of a lot of these projects have the danger of backing themselves into a corner. Actual play is, to the best that we can say, why people like actual play. One of the key reasons is people like watching other people who like each other have fun, right? That's the principle behind a lot of content. And so it's much harder to sell, metaphorically or literally, a story that you're collectively devising where the ending is not happy and or satisfying for those players. And so there's some really interesting things to think about in terms of the way that sympathy and empathy are constructed, about what we're willing to let people do to one another in those kinds of ways, especially in these more long form. You can get away with, say, like having players fight each other in a 1 or 2 episode, what's called a 1-shot or a 2-shot. But if you're spending hundreds of hours with a set of characters, how badly do you want them to have a happy ending? And what are you willing to sacrifice in terms of narrative structure in order to achieve that? Is a really interesting question, when at the same time, one of the great appeals of actual play is that it doesn't have to follow narrative expectations, because you've got these elements of chance, be they dice, be they cards, be they something else, that gives everybody an alibi to have the story go in a direction that you're not expecting.
A bunch of threads coming
It's what
out
I
of
do.
that. So, I mean, one of them, I think this kind of sort of, I suppose the question that I had lined up is no longer kind of relevant, but I think I might just briefly mention it because it comes out of what you were just saying there, that as a kind of genre, if we think actual play is a genre, I don't know if that's the best way to categorize it, but it's doing things that, say, literature, film, TV, maybe video games, in fact, can't. So, you're sort of hinting at it there in terms of, ideas that you're building this as you go, that there's elements of chance, but also clearly in terms of its long form nature. So one of the things I've kind of talked about a bit when I teach utopian dystopian fiction is that dystopias tend to be the kind of domains of films and sort of short form entertainment, where you have you want to see action, you want to kind of be entertained, you don't want to be part of that entertainment, you want to be entertained. And so that lends itself to danger, excitement, destruction, these kinds of things, right? Aesthetic destruction, spectacle. Whereas longer form forms of entertainment, like literature to some extent, not always, but to some extent, and TV, can often give us space to explore the more complex interrelationships that coincide with the utopias, right? So that when you're talking about long form, I mean, these are hundreds of hours, right? I don't know if our audience will necessarily know, but Critical Role's campaigns are hundreds of hours long. Each episode is what, 4 hours on average.
The longest episode of Critical Role is 8 hours. And Critical Role is definitely the kind of significant outlier, but it's a really good example of where actual play was in the 2010s, and that is having these kinds of very, very long times with the audience. And then you increasingly have short form. Short is still not short. Dimension 20 has 2-hour episodes, give or take, and their seasons are 4, 6, 8, and so on, up to about 21 episodes is their very longest. So still significant, but nowhere near as large as Critical Role. But yeah, it's an interesting artifact of the way that Twitch works, where Twitch really wanted people to be producing a certain number of hours like online each month in order for people to make partner. So imitating a Critical Role style model is a good way to ensure that you've got hours. And if you're doing long form narrative where people are following along and getting hooked, you're keeping the number of viewers that you want in order to kind of meet certain kinds of metrics. People
but
keep
it's also
saying
the case,
that,
right?
yeah,
Quite organically, that if this is people's games, I mean, I don't know
yeah,
about you, but when I play D&D, there's always that disappointment when the session ends, right? So you do just kind of keep going, right? There is kind of a
yeah.
naturalness to that. You want to keep playing, and
Yeah, absolutely. And what's one of the interesting things, I was talking about this yesterday with some actual players, is that at all levels of professionalism, or whatever you want to call it, there are people for whom actual play is is not as much about income as it is about accountability. It's about ensuring in these times where leisure is hard to find, it's a built-in way of committing, of saying we are going to meet to do this thing. And it's striking to me how many, I mean, the people of Critical Role say that, right? They continue to call this their home game, even though it is all of these other kinds of things. It is the core of a very large, compared to other things in the tabletop space, company, although quite small entertainment company, but with a lot of different projects. But that game in the middle of it, they still think of as their home game, and the kind of excuse they get to play with one another in ways that they do not in any other place.
The final boss of all D&D games is scheduling, right?
It's true.
You've talked about Critical Role a little bit so far, but again, I'm conscious that the audience might not know anything about Critical Role. So I mean, this part of the popularity of Dungeons and Dragons, it seems to me at least, its massive sort of increase in popularity stems from its sort of visibility in the Netflix show Stranger Things, where a lot of people kind of got involved that way, but also in terms of the online space from the success of this, what is, as you say, a kind of entertainment company called Critical Role. I mean, I share an interest. I'll just briefly mention this, that, I started watching Critical Role during COVID. I can't remember exactly how. I do know exactly how I came across it. They did a one shot for Doom, the video game, and I'd sort of had a passing interest in D&D. I'd played it once, I think, or twice at that point. And I just sort of I got to watching this one shot. So sometimes I suppose the way into it is not through their main campaigns, but through their collaboration with other franchises, where they're kind of they've done a lot of sort of video game one shots, haven't they? And so I started watching that, and I mean, the production values is really, even when I started watching, which was many years ago now, it was significant then. Now it's just incredible production values. But I got really invested
not always. In it. Yeah.
Yeah, it wasn't always. Yeah, absolutely. So maybe you might say a little bit about the beginnings of Critical Role, because I think that's tied into specifically this idea of utopia, right? And this idea of sort of the value of friends and coming together to play these games.
Yeah. So one of the things that's important to remember is that Wizards of the Coast, the publishers of Dungeons and Dragons, have never fully really kind of gotten their heads around, is that actual play, I would argue, is the engine by which the 5th edition of Dungeons and Dragons, and indeed also the 4th edition of Dungeons and Dragons, really gets disseminated, far more than, quite honestly, Stranger Things. We don't hear a whole lot of anecdata about Stranger Things bringing people into the hobby. It's far more of kind of nostalgia fodder, and that sort of thing. Acquisitions Incorporated, before Stranger Things even appeared on air, was already working with Wizards of the Coast to do live events at their PAX conventions, and as well as podcasts and other, basically every form that an actual play can take, pre-recorded, live, in person, remote, all of those sorts of things. Acquisitions Incorporated has done. It's not the first actual play by a significant amount, but in terms of the impact on Dungeons and Dragons, it's the biggie. And in fact, it's quite notable that they have not consistently played D&D in recent years, because other companies are willing to sponsor in ways Wizards is not. And so it's on those kinds of waves of this kind of emerging 5th edition in 2014, 2015, that we see the Adventure Zone, which is the brainchild of the McElroy family, 2 of whom are part of the founding editorial team of the journalism website Polygon, and so had access to the early edition, and it becomes part of their kind of body of almost a dozen podcasts. It's originally intended as additional content, and like 1 or 2 episodes, and it becomes its own thing. At the same time, you get Critical Role, and Critical Role was not the actual play that Geek and Sundry threw the most resources into that year. They were betting on Will Wheaton, most famous at the time for being, quote, just a geek, the name of one of his memoirs. He had risen to fame as a very young person with Stand By Me and with appearances on Star Trek The Next Generation. And at the time, he was the most successful personality moving board games. The Tabletop Effect, which is named for the show that he had, if your game was featured on that show, it was a sellout. And so the 3rd season was crowdfunded, and the $1 million goal, after all of the other kind of stretch goals were met, was an actual play, an edited, short, highly produced actual play called Titan's Grave. And that was what Geek and Sundry thought was going to be the actual play of 2015. And it had voice actors, it had Wheaton, it had Hank Green, who of course was rising rapidly as a YouTuber at the time. It had all of the trappings of success, including high production value. It even had Laura Bailey, who's also a cast member on Critical Role, which was also filming live, not pre-recorded, not edited, on janky IKEA tables and with cameras that could not do focal depth in the ways that were necessary in order to switch between live cameras. And so that's why, if you're at all familiar with actual play, you'll know that a lot of video actual play has different cameras pointed and then put into a composite layout where you can see everyone at the same time. That's basically created by Critical Role's producers to account for the fact that they need to be able to crop the head and the bottom so that wires aren't showing all over the place. So this thing is built on a shoestring with set materials that were brought by the cast. And it debuts in March, but what happens is it appears on the front page of Twitch for weeks or months, depending on who you ask, thanks to a deal that Geek and Sundry had posted. And for whatever reason, it catches fire and becomes enormously popular. It's the most popular thing on Geek and Sundry. It certainly beats Titan's Grave and Critical Role kind of moves from strength to strength through, from there on. It is also part of an ecosystem that had been getting built by Greg Tito, who was the senior communications manager at Wizards of the Coast at the time, bringing together different actual plays, discovering them and interviewing them for Dragon Talk, which was a real discovery engine, and increasingly in the late 2010s, these D&D live events that included Critical Role, but also things like High Rollers, which is based in the UK, and Girls Guts Glory, an all-female group, among Maze Arcana, among many others. And so you had this kind of community of practice that's kind of emerging at the time that could reach out into different kinds of ways and give the sense of that there was a D&D community. And whether that actually existed or not, an imagined community was certainly there. This utopian ideal, if we're going to kind of lean back into that word, those D&D live events gave you this sense that not only could these people all kind of work and play in harmony, but also increasingly audiences were allowed to come into these immersive spaces before they got to watch actual plays being played live. And so there was also this sense that there were fewer boundaries between audience and players, and that you could become a player. And there was a real strong sense in that period that you could potentially, if you started an actual play, you could maybe make it all the way to playing with Mercer et al. And so it's this really that dies pretty quickly, especially after Wizards kind of divests a lot of its support and funding. But it's a really powerful incentive, not only to make actual play, but to specifically make D&D actual play, to be part of this particular part of the actual play idea of community. And it's striking to me that, you know, we now see things like D&D in a castle. You can play D&D at sea. You can have these kinds of high touch experiences with kind of lower level actual players, in addition to kind of the celebrity fan culture of bigger actual play. And it's selling a really particular kind of shared vocabulary, shared sense of community that, yeah, is very striking. And that Wizards has never entirely understood, I don't even want to say how to take advantage of. They can see how they might want to take advantage of it, but they're just not really good at it. So that all of the stuff that is kind of the creative side of D&D is generally not owned by Wizards of the Coast, you know, for any number of reasons. Anytime they do stuff in-house, it does not especially go well for them.
But I think that sort of speaks, doesn't it, to the informal ad hoc nature of it, the spontaneousness of it, and the liveness of it, right? When you start bringing it into this big sort of corporate franchise, you dilute that. I mean, I read somewhere that originally with Geek and Sundry had basically said, well, we'll incorporate like video game sort of passages when you have your combat and things like that into the show. And Mercer was like, no, we just want, I think what people want to see is just some friends sitting around playing D&D, which is exactly what I think led to their success. It was that sense of kind of you're part and parcel of it. And certainly my experience of watching I started watching their second campaign, so I actually missed most of that stuff. I've been back and I've seen those kind of origin points, and it was much slicker by the time that I was watching it. But at the same time, there was something about these players and these people that it felt like they were just good friends having a good time. They didn't care about anything else, and that was really what was inspiring about it. Yes, they're very talented. I mean, they are voice actors, and they've all got their own individual careers that have obviously blossomed in the wake of their success in Critical Role, but also pre-existed that. But I just think that's for me where it comes from, and also that they can take some credit, I think, for the general tenor of the fan space around them, right? So that's what feels utopian to me, is that sense of community, but in a way that felt different, I think, to other franchises. A lot of like big franchises, you talked about sort of Will Wheaton, Star Trek, etc. They have these, communities very active online, but they also can often be quite toxic spaces. Whereas I kind of felt a bit like Critical Role took more of a lead in engaging with that fan space and deliberately creating and fostering an inclusive, welcoming environment that felt utopian and friendly and personal. Like, so Critical Role also did a lot of, as they got going, they did a lot of ancillary shows, as you sort of already hinted
the
at.
everything is content period.
Yes.
Which they now are, of course, doing for their own platform, Beacon. So it's interesting.
That felt like inviting us into their lives, right? That felt like and sometimes they're filmed in their houses and things like that. And it's like a sort of peek into into what they're about.
I mean, and it's interesting, right? Because like the history of I often think about the invisible fences of the 18th century because I'm a trained 18th centuryist, and so I must include, landscape design in my thinking. But there's this notion of an invisible fence that was popularized in the 18th century called the ha-ha, right? You dig a trench. And you put the fence inside the trench, and the visual effect of it is that you don't see the fence unless you're right up on it. So you can have a view from your stately country home out onto the fields and pastures, but the cows can't get into your ornamental rose garden, right? And a lot of what we see in the most savvy actual play, and Critical Role is part of this, is is the building of those kinds of ha-has. That doesn't happen from the start. The story of early Critical Role at Geek and Sundry is full of weird boundary stuff in terms of fans being able to access the studio, or the nearby bar Guildhall, where people would watch at the different actual plays, including Critical Role, and then what was for a while a reasonable kind of fan creator interaction would sometimes broach boundaries. But the reality is that also people don't scale. And this is something that I've realized more and more. And part of my future work, I think, is going to be about specifically the nature of different kinds of micro celebrity, what I call in the book relapsing, remitting fame. I could walk down the street in Alabama with Matt Mercer and only get stopped once, right? He went to a barbecue shop and the back of the house was very surprised that he was there. And one of the challenges of bringing these kinds of situationally famous folks to spaces is you don't actually know how intense and how large a particular reaction will be at any given time. So you both have to prepare as if, it's the Beatles, but also it's just a guy, right? And you have to have that kind of dual impact. And the scale thing also applies to fandom more broadly, right? With a small audience, you can indeed set the tone, have some kinds of reasonably high touch experiences, be in correspondence with fan artists, all of these kinds of things. Critical Role has grown far, far past a single nexus of fandom. Critical Role has never been entirely able to curate all of its fan spaces and has kind of ceded a lot of territory. It was really interesting to me when Beacon, as Critical Role's private platform, decided to create a Discord, a private forum, the same week that Dropout announced that it would be closing its comparable Discord because the costs of moderation were just too high relative to the number of their kind of fans who were using the space. And so one of the things that I think a lot about is the ways in which Critical Role has had, or at least the cast owners have had to learn quickly. And it's a miracle that they have done it with a fair amount of grace, how to navigate this kind of situational fame that is both very, very present and also a nothing burger, depending on where they are. I've talked to similar kinds of micro celebrities. I, in my own academic way, have a tiny taste of it and know that it does not take much in terms of fan interaction, especially for any number of reasons in this particular kind of fandom, to have kind of it become a kind of a certain amount of friction or difficulty, which is not to say that those aren't meaningful interactions, just they can be intense and draining, and the expectation that you be kind of on is a lot for a lot of these folks, especially people who record remotely, especially for people who may not have the kind of prior fan experience that most of the cast of Critical Role were coming into this process with familiarity with the nature of fandom, both as being fans, but also as being voice actors who had a different kind of situational fandom before this. But it's really striking to me, and something that I think a lot about, is that Critical Role really wanted to make it so that their fandom was this kind of unified, what we might call kumbaya kind of space. And at a certain point, there's too many people coming in from too many different pathways. The animated series, the graphic novels, in addition to the actual play, different generations, different ages, different cultures of practice in terms of, Tumblr versus Reddit versus TikTok. And having a unified fan experience is just critters generally tend to be pretty reasonable in person, I would say. But certainly those online communities are vastly different. And the kind of self-policing that I was observing in the late 2010s in terms of the fandom being aligned in terms of with the company in very specific kinds of ways doesn't seem to be quite the case in the same way anymore. In addition to that, you get this interesting challenge of I had one early producer of Critical Role very cynically say to me, I don't think there are any fan artists in among critters. And I think that's overstating the case. But what he was arguing was that a lot of the fan work that's connected to Critical Role is opportunistic, is people who are trying to get into what is a very creator-friendly ecosystem. Critical Role has been very supportive of smaller actual plays in different kinds of ways, of fan art, which is often art actually made by professionals, among many other kinds of things. They have launched, Critical Role, interestingly, has been the launching point for a lot of other careers in interesting kinds of ways. Yeah, and it's interesting and kind of muddy. And so to think about it in utopian ways, I think is definitely the story of the origins of it. And of course, like most utopias, utopia, as we both know, is no place.
But that's, for me, what's interesting, D&D, it's a no place. That's where these utopias can be actualized, right? I'm going slightly off topic here, but this is the subject of something I was writing about, so I kind of I won't go to too much detail, but you're making me want to have to rewrite this lovely little piece I was writing on everything is content. Sort of playful as everything is content, and thinking about sort of the origin points of Critical Role's sort of fan spaces and the size and scale of utopian communities and how they've kind of managed to juggle that sort of growth from nothing to astronomical kind of success. But maybe we'll park that for the time being. I could talk about Critical Role all day, but I kind of wanted to get back to TTRPGs and actual play a little bit more broadly in terms of these as political spaces. So they're obviously spaces that primarily are viewed as playful spaces, as places of escape. We don't tend to go there to talk about politics, but do they, in your experience, also often bleed into those political spaces? How much do the politics of the players get brought into this? And we could talk about Critical Role with that, but yeah.
Well,
in general.
I think the reality is that I just did an interview a few weeks ago for The Guardian about the use of actual play in kind of various kinds of anti-fascist work and different kinds of progressive goals. Brennan Lee Mulligan is the most famous example of this. Of course, he has been doing various fundraising actual play events in support of Democratic Socialist candidates in a variety of cities, including the city in which he lives, Los Angeles. Has also shot kind of promo ads. He's not the only one, but he's, of course, the person who is famous. Dimension 20 is famous for capitalism is always the big bad evil guy, which is an overstatement, but it's not far from the truth. That Brennan very much sees his kind of storytelling work aligned with particular kinds of politics. We can see this also in Abria Iyengar's work, which is often a meditation. She has said to me that any game that she has ever run in terms of actual play has been a meditation on the Black experience in the United States. Which is to say meditations on power and identity and history and responsibility and all of these sorts of things. And when we look to what I have termed in the book, and it's also in the actual play Wikipedia entry at this point because of Polygon, the ambitious middle, the folks who are not necessarily kind of household names, even among a particular nerd set, but are doing innovative boundary pushing work. You've got Transplanar, which is, famously kind of rejecting colonialist principles for storytelling, is all trans, is trying to tell liberatory stories, dramatic stories in their frame. So I think that there's a lot of actual players who are very interested either in choice of system, because a lot of TTRPGs in the so-called indie space are kind of things like Eat the Reich or other kinds of games, or Spire, which is a game about, having a bad time, being a counter-revolutionary. There's a whole kind of progressive and leftist spirit in particular. There's, of course, also an extraordinarily, conservative and nationalist and what have you kind of thread. These are two different parts of the hobby. These are two different parts of actual play that you can find both if you search around enough on YouTube, Twitch, and your podcast stream. But yeah, so this is deeply pervasive in the kind of sense of there's a new media form that is being put to those kinds of playing in new imaginary worlds.
We're coming to the end of the interview now, Emily. I could chat for ages about this stuff, but my co-host will be deeply upset if I send a whacking great 4-hour file to digest and edit. Yeah, so I wanted to talk about your research. Obviously, you're coming from that background, as you say, as an 18th century ist, and you've gone in a radically different direction. And you've talked a little bit about books you're working on, etc. Might you tell us a little bit about what you're currently working on, the things that might be of interest to our audience?
Yeah. So my book, The Actual History of Actual Play, or at least that's the working title, will be out with MIT next year in 2027. I am at work. The University of Michigan Press has a series that is kind of mini graphs of about 40,000 words, focused on one game and one idea. The first game and book in that series is Unsettling Catan. And I'll be working on a book on Die, the comic and game as acts of creative criticism, and incorporating people like the Brontes into the history of role-playing. And then it's interesting to see what will happen. I am serving as the public scholarship, public humanities fellow at the Folger Shakespeare Library in Washington, D.C. in the 2026-2027 school year, which allows me some time to literally play the games that are held by the Folger, work with local game designers to kind of allow them to have access to the collection. The Folger has already made a D&D adventure based at the Folger and based on holdings of the Folger, as well as a board game with Fort Circle called First Folio. So there's a really interesting catalytic moment in that area for thinking about the ways that history and culture and cultural institutions interact with this kind of indie game scene. In addition to that, I am currently recording. We're able to record while I'm in the UK, and I've been working with a variety of institutions over here to do similar kinds of connecting work. Now, what is all of that going to lead to in terms of future research is a really interesting question that I'm playing to find out. Some things that are kind of in progress beyond the next two books are our work on micro-celebrity and friendship, as well as some possible thinking about the ways that TTRPGs and games more generally encounter different kinds of big ideas. And so one of the nice things about being in actual play and studying and working alongside actual players is that I know various kinds of producers and thinkers so that I can think about what's the right format for different work that I'm going to be doing. What makes sense as a book, what makes sense as articles, and what makes sense in terms of maybe video or audio content. It's an interesting thing that I'm looking forward to exploring in the years to come.
Well, with all that lined up, I feel very privileged we managed to snatch you away for a quick hour chat. We always ask our guests at the end to recommend a piece of reading. Could be academic, could be fiction, could be game, something you recommend them that people want to play. So yeah, have you got something for us?
Well, for folks who are really interested in these kinds of questions about fantasy, I am a huge fan of Kieran Gillen's Die, the graphic novel series. It is currently, so there's 20 issues that have been collected into a bound collected through Image Comics of the first series, and it is now in its second series, which is called Die Loaded. I blurbed the first volume of that. What I particularly love about Die Loaded, although the whole thing is a beautiful meditation on fantasy and why we tell stories and why we play role-playing games, Die Loaded is a really interesting example of a game group that is kind of thrown together. And the motto of Die Loaded is that there are no NPCs, no non-player characters. In other words, everyone matters. I am, at the time of this recording, about to put that principle into practice. I'm a big believer in the safety principle espoused by Meg A. Baker in conversation with Emily Boss, which is the idea of I will not abandon you. I will not abandon you is not something you can say ahead of time, but instead it is an invitation to reflect after you have played with other people and really decide for yourself and understand if you have successfully ensured that everyone was taken care of and safe. And I find that to be really strongly present in Kieran's work, and it's the reason, I'll be honest, why we're friends. So I highly, highly recommend, if you know nothing about tabletop role playing, if you know everything about tabletop role playing, Die is a really beautiful meditation on parenthood and gender and identity as well as play.
Sounds distinctly utopian as a principle as well. Fabulous.
No, it's a nightmare, but it's
Well,
awesome.
with the principles. Thanks so much, Emily. I've had a great time chatting to you, and really
Yeah.
appreciate you taking the time.
Thank you to Emily for appearing on the podcast. Matt and I really enjoyed nerding out about all things TTRPG, actual play, and utopianism. If you enjoyed what you heard today, you can let us know by rating and following the podcast, writing a comment, or sending us an email on utopian and dystopian fictions@gmail.com. And of course, please do tune in next time, where we will explore some more utopian and dystopian fictions.